Good morning, friends. It's morning for me, but may not be morning for you. Not sure what time you'll end up accessing this video. This is the first lesson in a 6 or 7 part series on the books of Joshua through 2 Kings as part of our adult Sunday classes for Trinity Baptist Church. And if you're looking at this scope, this range of books, you realize this is a big chunk of scripture. And yes, it is. And that means we're going to have to fly by. But thankfully, the purpose of this is not to give a detailed exposition of each book of the Old Testament, this section of the Old Testament, but rather to give an overview so that after having gone through these books, you will have a clearer grasp of their themes and how they anticipate the New Testament, particularly the person and work of Jesus Christ. So my goal for this class, that by the end of this class, you'll be able to express the theme of each of the historical books and have a grasp of how these themes anticipate Christ, as I just mentioned, that you'll have the basic skills necessary to profitably read and apply this section of Scripture, and ultimately, that your affections would be moved for the God who refuses to give up on his failing people. And we find that commitment to his covenant expressed with blazing wonder at the cross of Jesus Christ. And that's what this is all about, pointing to Jesus, helping you read your Bible better for personal and spiritual profit. And so how are we going to go through these lessons? Well, we're going to have to, again, take one, almost for every lesson, one book at a session. So this week will be Joshua. We'll go with Judges. We're going to take divide 1 Samuel into 2 weeks, talking about that, 2 Samuel, and then the 1st and 2nd Kings. Well, as we get to the book of Joshua, though, we want to get a summary of where we've been to this point. So opening the book of Joshua means that we're closing the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and where have we left off? That's the thing I want to pick up here. So the Abrahamic covenant, that is God's covenant with Abraham, has these 3 components of descendants, the word is seed there, and land and blessing. So remember in Genesis chapter 12, 15, and 17, God had spoken to Abraham, and he said, I am going to give you descendants. Well, at that point, Abraham didn't even have a son. He and Sarai were too old to have children. God says, I'm going to give you a land. Well, Abraham was just a wanderer at that time, and he lived in tents. He didn't have a place. And God said, and this is the real crux of this covenant, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to make you a blessing, and through you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. Well, what this blessing was isn't specified, isn't laid out in detail here in the Abrahamic covenant, but these are the 3 components of the covenant. And as we unfold the pages of the Pentateuch, we're just by way of review, we're looking back at the first 5 books of the Bible, we're seeing how God begins to fulfill these promises. God, yes, indeed gives Abraham a son miraculously. Abraham's son, Isaac, has a son miraculously, and they begin to multiply. Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons and some daughters, and those 12 sons, as we know, find themselves in Egypt, where they begin to multiply. In the book of Exodus, Pharaoh, who is a descendant of the serpent who tries to exterminate the seed of the woman, is attempting to get rid of God's people. God overturns Pharaoh's schemes, delivers his people through Moses out of Egypt into the wilderness, where they wander for 40 years, and that takes us to the cusp of the promised land. So the descendants are there. The blessing appears to be in place because God has given them a law. He's given them instructions for the building of a tabernacle, and in the keeping of the law, in that tabernacle, they are to enjoy the presence of God, which is the source of all blessing. But the component of the covenant that they don't have at this point is the land, and that is what Joshua is all about, the land. The land is a massive theme in the book of Joshua. So they don't have any land, but they're poised between the horrible wilderness and the happy promised land of Canaan. Moses has died, and Joshua is their new leader, is going to take their place. And now the question that should be on our minds is this. Okay, now that God has fulfilled his promise in giving his people, giving Abraham descendants, the seed component of the covenant is there, the blessing appears to be in place. now will they take the land? Will they take this new Eden, the place of God's blessing? But the problem is that a problem that we've seen earlier throughout the Pentateuch, and that is, are God's people, will they prove themselves worthy of God's blessing? Will they prove themselves worthy to keep the land? And that question will be under the surface throughout the book of Joshua, and it's going to emerge really, really clearly as the book of Joshua comes to a close. Let's look at an overview. An overview of Joshua, we can divide Joshua into some simple parts that may help us wrap our minds around it. We have the possessing of the promised land, the dividing of the promised land, and then at the close, Israel is united to serve God in the promised land. So the possessing of the promised land occupies chapters 1 through 12. The dividing of the promised land occupies chapter 13 through 21. And then Israel's being united to serve God in the promised land is the last chapters there, 22, 23, and 24. So we'll begin with the possessing of the promised land. You see there a summary of the book of Joshua, and this is what I want to get into our minds here, is that Joshua leads God's people into the promised land, but to stay there, they must keep God's law. And we're going to see this theme throughout, and that is that Israel fails. They fail to obey God completely, and despite their failure, God continues to keep his promise. We see their failure in the situation with Achan that we're going to look at in a little bit, with Joshua's failure to consult the Lord when the Gibeonites came to make a covenant with Joshua. Joshua didn't consult the Lord. He relied on his own wisdom. And this reinforces a message that is central to Joshua and that's central to the entire Old Testament, and that is salvation is of the Lord. If salvation is going to come about, it's not going to be as a result of human effort. It's going to be from the Lord alone. So possessing the promised land, chapters 1 through 12. They prepare to possess the land, and to do so, they have to install Joshua as the leader. Now, these first opening chapters of Joshua, they strike us with this personal exhortation to Joshua to be courageous. He's going to have good success. God's presence will be with him, but he must keep the law of God. And these themes are connected. We see the four themes here in Joshua's installation as the leader. We see the presence of God, God's promise that they'll be successful, and the necessity of knowing and keeping the law of God, and the courage that comes with that. And these are connected. God's presence guaranteed that his people, who are led and represented by Joshua, would be successful. It meant also that they could be courageous, but the presence of God and the courage of God's people and the success of God's people meant that they must keep God's law. That's why this is such an important point right off the bat. In the first chapter of Joshua, God is saying, you must meditate on my law so that you can keep it. Meditate on it day and night. Don't let it depart out of your head. Don't let it depart out of your mouth. Constantly rehearse the words of the law that I gave to my servant Moses, because if you rehearse them, you'll be able to do them. And if you do them, you'll have my presence with you. And if you have my presence with you, you'll be successful and you will have courage. So be strong and be courageous. That's his exhortation that God gives to Joshua. But as the book of Joshua begins to unfold, we realize that Joshua, while he is a role model of courage and obedience, he's still flawed. Here's the point that the New Testament, in reflecting on the book of Joshua, makes, particularly in the book of Hebrews, that although Joshua could lead the people of God into the land, Joshua could not lead them into that ultimate rest that God wants for his people. Thus, the writer of Hebrews, and I'm reading from my notes here, points to Jesus as a better Joshua. Only Jesus could lead us into the Sabbath rest. That is the ceasing of our striving to achieve what God offers by his grace. But because Jesus, in contrast to Joshua, perfectly keeps the law on our behalf, he is our merciful and faithful high priest. And we can enter, because of Jesus, we can enter God's presence with courage. And that's what Joshua could not do. Joshua could lead the people of Israel into the land, but he could not lead them into the presence of God. Why? Because he too was a flawed leader. So Joshua was installed a leader. That's an important point in a preparation to possess the land. We also see this story of Rahab and the spies. Now we look at Rahab, and we see this story of her in contrast to the city in which he dwelled, allowing the spies, giving refuge to the spies, and then the spies that were given refuge by Rahab promised that they would spare her life because of what she did. Now, Hebrews, we're going back to Hebrews because Hebrews also speaks of Rahab in the book of Joshua. Rahab is commended as a woman of faith in contrast to the unbelief of those around her. Rahab also appears in the genealogy of Christ. Now, this is just a striking feature of God's grace, that the most unlikely of people, a Canaanite prostitute, finds herself, her name, in the genealogy, the ancestry of the Messiah. This is unbelievable. That of all people that could have been included, of all the noble women, the godly women that lived at that time, here is an outsider, and an outsider who is a prostitute, no less. And yet God uses broken, crooked things to highlight his grace. Now, if it's a wonder that Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, made her way into the ancestry of Jesus Christ, it is no less a wonder that you and I, because of Jesus Christ, can be considered fellow heirs with him. In fact, going back to the book of Hebrews, in chapter 2, the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is not ashamed to call us not just his ancestors, but his brothers. What an amazing thing grace is. Now, that's Rahab and the spies. Now, they possess that. We're still on the point of them possessing the land. They enter the land. They cross the Jordan. They begin to conquer the land in chapter 5. Now, here's a very interesting story of their when they begin to conquer the land, and that is Joshua's encounter with the commander of the Lord's army. I'm actually going to take my Bible and read parts of this incident to you, because it is very similar to Moses' encounter with God at the burning bush. And it reminds us that Joshua indeed is taking Moses' place as the leader of God's people. But Joshua, like Moses, had to respond to the holiness of God. This is from Joshua chapter 5, verse 13. When Joshua was by Jericho, this is they're preparing to enter the promised land. They're preparing to defeat Jericho, rather. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. Now, this must have been absolutely terrifying to Joshua. Joshua thought he was by himself. Furthermore, he was ready to attack a city, and to see a man he did not recognize holding an unsheathed sword must have sent chills up and down his spine. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "There's courage right there. Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Joshua understandably wants to know, is this just one of the Israelites I don't recognize? Is this a Canaanite who is here to kill me? Is this somebody else? I don't know who it is. I need to know, are you on our team? Are you not on our team? That's what Joshua wants to find out. But notice the response of the commander. He says, no. No what? No, he's not an Israelite, and he's not a Canaanite. He fights for himself, which foreshadows what's going to happen. God works for his own sake. God is not obligated to defeat the Canaanites because the Israelites have proven their moral superiority. God is operating by grace alone. He says, no, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. And Joshua realizes this is no mere human. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, he didn't give him battle plans. He didn't give him a strategy for attacking Jericho. He said this, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." Here's what Joshua needed to learn that the key to victory was not in military strategy or might. The key to victory was recognizing the holiness of God. And in recognizing the holiness of God, to do exactly what God had told him to do at the beginning of Joshua, and that is, don't let the word of this holy God depart from your mouth, but meditate on it day and night, and then you'll find your way prosperous and successful. God will be with you. Know that he's holy. And this encounter with the commander of the Lord's army foreshadows the importance of keeping God's holy law. Well, the fall of Jericho followed this. The strategy of Israel's first battle looked pathetic, but it highlighted what again would be a theme for the rest of her conquest. The rest of the book of Joshua is that the battle is the Lord's. Israel must trust and obey. But there was a problem, because during the battle of Jericho, one of God's people disobeyed God's law. Now, if you've been tracking with us to this point, you know this is going to be a really big and bad deal, because God has just emphasized the importance of keeping his law. That success is predicated not upon military strategy, not upon just what makes sense to you. Lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. But here is a man who decided to choose his own path, Achan, and take things that were forbidden. The problem was not so much that Achan stole. The problem was that he disobeyed God's command. There's no denying that Achan's punishment was severe, but it serves to highlight the seriousness of disobedience, the importance of keeping God's law. If God's people will enter the land, it must be, especially their very first battle, must be fought in obedience to God, not in rebellion against God. And this incident of Achan also, you read the story and the punishment is disturbing. But it illustrates this, that sin never stays private. The sins we think are personal and private and no one knows, they spread. As in Adam, all died, Paul writes. As in Achan, 36 men were killed. As in you and me, people are impacted. Sin has a ripple effect. A stone of sin once cast into the pond of our lives creates tidal waves that we cannot negotiate the size of. And only grace is powerful enough to still those waters. And yet sin has consequences. And Achan's story is an example of that. We can choose our sin, but we cannot choose our sin's consequences. Finally, though, Ai is destroyed, and the covenant is renewed at Mount Ebal. The sun, and I'm skipping some sections here just for the sake of time. The sun stands still. 5 Amorite kings are killed. The northern and southern cities are conquered. Northern kings defeated. We have a list of the defeated kings there in chapter 12. And that takes us to the second section of the book of Joshua, and that is the dividing of the promised land. Now, when you read this section, you might find it tedious, but to the Israelites, it wasn't tedious or boring. Why? Because you're talking about their land. When Krista and I bought our first home, and we get a description of the property, and it's the words that talk about specific landmarks on our property. From this stone, go this amount of this distance, and then take a particular direction. I cannot repeat to you what it was, because it was so complex, actually, the description. And yeah, if it's not your property, it's going to be boring. But if that's your property, you want to know where the boundary lines are. You want to know the extent of what you have purchased. And that, to the Israelites, was of intense importance and interest. For one thing, it meant that the land was theirs, and for another, it was God's gracious way of ensuring them that there would be no territory disputes among the tribes. The regions allotted them were given by the divine map maker. And then Israel was united to serve God in the promised land. This book ends with a a farewell address that Joshua gives, the covenant being renewed at Shechem, and Joshua being buried. And there's this question in our minds, because the people have, to this point in the Pentateuch and also in Joshua, have proven themselves so unable to keep the law of God, and yet with such enthusiasm and confidence, they say, we are going to keep the law of God. We are in the land. God has given this to us by his grace, and we will uphold the law of God. We'll keep the sacrifices. We'll keep the 10 commandments. We'll be pure and fair and just in all our dealings. And we can't help but wonder, will they really? For one thing, we know our own hearts. Will they really? And that question is hanging in our minds as we close the book of Joshua. Now, a couple of comments I want to make in closing. First of all, as we look back on the book of Joshua, we can observe that the various ways in which Israel had victory over her enemies, think about it, marching around a city to make the walls come down, setting an ambush, a hailstorm, and the halting of the sun and moon. Joshua is a book of conquest, but no general would go to the book of Joshua to learn how to fight battles. Why? Because these varying strategies were meant to highlight not Israel's military skill, but God. In fact, God is the main character. God and God alone is the victor in these battles against his enemies. I quote from the New American Commentary on that section, on that theme. So there are two, in closing, there are two questions or two issues that I want to raise. The first one has to do with sovereignty and grace, God's divine sovereignty and grace. And the second one has to do, it's an ethical question dealing with the conquest of the Canaanites. We'll look back at Joshua. This is the theme of sovereignty and grace. And we realize that God is acting not because of the goodness of the people of Israel, but because he's a gracious God. He is sovereign over the victory, but what is on display is not their virtue, but God's grace and power. God himself is at work to give his people the land. God's grace is on display, giving his people the land, not because they earned it and not because they were morally upright, but because God is faithful in keeping his promise. That's sovereignty and grace at work. We see that in our lives too. The reason why God saves us is not because that we are more morally upright than anybody. In fact, we of all people recognize that we're so sinful. Jesus died on the cross for us. And yet our lives can be displays, trophy cases of the grace of God. There's another question, and that is this. What about the conquest of the Canaanites? This raises an ethical question. It's disturbing to us to read that so many people were just wiped out and slaughtered as a result of the invasion of the Israelites. I'm going to ask some questions about it. A lot has been written on this, and you can read a lot on this, but let me give you some pointers to help set you in the right direction. First is a question. Was this an ethnic cleansing? Was what motivated the killing of these people because they were of a particular race or ethnic group? Some people assume that the killing of the Canaanites was similar to the atrocities of the ethnic cleansings witnessed in the 20th century, such as the Jewish Holocaust under Nazi Germany or the Armenian genocide. But the Israelite conquest of Canaan was different because the Canaanites, there are hints that the Canaanites were given opportunities to turn, and that some of them were actually spared. For example, Rahab and the Gibeonites and others. And another major argument in the fact that this is not an ethnic cleansing is that the Israelites themselves were not exempt from slaughter in case of sin. At Sinai, in the wilderness, there were 3,000 Israelites killed after they flagrantly broke the law of God when Moses was on the mountain receiving the law. See, God's justice is applied indiscriminately to people who break the law. So this was not an ethnic cleansing. So what was the nature of the destruction? So there's three factors that I want us to understand here as we think about this. And again, this is not going to answer every question. However, this will help set us in the right direction. First of all, we have hints beginning all the way in the book of Genesis that there was some extreme moral depravity that was warranting or inviting the destruction of the Canaanites, the extreme moral depravity of their sin. This included sexual corruption and child sacrifice. This is mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 29 to 31. The slaughter of the Canaanites was God's divine and deserved judgment on extreme sinfulness, perhaps even of a uniquely outrageous kind. And God even told Abraham that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In other words, they were sinning and sinning and sinning. God said, okay, I'm going to let this go, but there's going to be a time limit. And that time limit was when the Israelites stepped foot in the land of Canaan and when the Canaanites met the sword of the Israelites. The extreme moral depravity, that should help us understand one reason, one rationale why the Canaanites, many of the Canaanites were exterminated. Now, a second consideration is the danger of influence on God's people. The holiness of God's people was at stake, their sacredness, their moral uprightness. God wanted a people as a priesthood, as a people that would reflect his moral character, and was aware of the influence of the Canaanites, the potential degradation and polluting that could happen if they came into contact with such vileness. God knew the hearts of his people. And so God tells his people, and we find this both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, lest the sins of the Canaanites infiltrate the ranks of the Israelites, the danger of influence on God's people. So the extreme moral depravity of the sin of the Canaanites, the danger of their influence on God's people. And then thirdly, there was a possibility of mercy. We see this in Joshua 6:25. It's also implied in Hebrews 11:31, when the writer to the Hebrews implies that the others did not believe as Rahab did, indicating that in some cases at least, the people of Canaan had an opportunity to turn from their idols to the one true God. Now, the motivation for the destruction of the Canaanites was not ethnic. This was not genocide or ethnic cleansing. It was a unique time in history, a time when God was keeping his ancient promise that the people would inherit a land. And this means that we find no precedent here for people to commit such violence today. There are these factors, and I'll just summarize. God was judging a people for uniquely depraved sins. He was protecting his people from these depraved influences. There are hints that these people had opportunities to repent and turn to the God of Israel. And one point I didn't mention is that the military descriptions that every living thing was wiped out differ from what the actual case. Not to say that it's the military descriptions are inaccurate, but that they were referring to the hostilities. So the cessation of the hostilities included the killing of everyone involved there, even though other Canaanites remained that were not involved in those battles. And we know this because God, even after the Canaanites wars were over, God was warning his people not to intermarry with them, implying in order to intermarry with them, they had to be living. There had to be Canaanites still in the land. Now, what do we do with this? Does this still trouble us, or does this like, oh, no problem? Okay, I totally get it. No, there is an element to this which is still deeply disturbing, even given these factors. We have to understand that we look at this and we ask, why would God allow this to happen? Or why would God not just allow this, but authorize and command this? We need to understand that what is in question is not God's righteousness, but our righteousness, our justice. If God is God, he has his reasons for doing what he does and is not obligated to defend himself to us. And what many people fail to consider when they think about these things is that every human being deserves God's judgment. Every sin deserves eternal consequences. The New Testament does not portray God any less indignant against sin. It's not as if there is a wrathful God of the Old Testament, an angry, indignant God of the book of Joshua, and yet there is a kind and forgiving God of the New Testament. Oh, the God of the Old Testament is just as forgiving as the God of the New Testament, but the God of the New Testament is just as indignant with sin as the God of the Old Testament. Jesus does not shrink from describing the torments of hell, and the book of Revelation foretells the horrible end and the destiny of those who refuse to trust in God. And the smoke of their torment ascend forever and ever. Now, these are hard words. The cross itself is a display of God's righteous wrath against sin. At the same time, it displays God's love and invites us to trust in him. No human being, no mere human being could perfectly keep God's law, and thus no mere human being deserves God's blessing except Jesus Christ and him alone. Jesus perfectly kept God's law. Jesus can lead us into the rest of God. The rest, the cessation from our striving to earn our own way to God. That's what Jesus can do. Jesus can do what Joshua couldn't do. So there's the theme of Joshua. There's a summary. There are ways in which it points to Christ. Joshua leads God's people into the promised land, but to stay there, they must keep God's law.